Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow as she refilled the coffee pot for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The small diner where she worked had been unusually busy, and her feet ached in her worn-out shoes she couldn't afford to replace, not with rent due in 3 days and her bank account hovering dangerously close to empty. She'd been picking up double shifts for weeks now, trying desperately to stay afloat in a sea of mounting bills that threatened to drown her. "Order up!" The cook's voice rang out over the clatter of dishes and murmur of conversation. Marcus, a burly man with tattoos covering his forearms and a heart as big as his appetite, slid 2 plates across the stainless steel counter. Despite the morning rush, he still managed to give Sarah a sympathetic smile. He knew her situation better than most, had even slipped her leftover food on more than one occasion when Hal wasn't looking. "Hanging in there, kiddo?" Marcus asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah forced a smile. "One day at a time, right?" She squared her shoulders and grabbed the plates, determined not to let her exhaustion show to the customers. The diner itself was nothing special, just another roadside establishment off Highway 40, with vinyl booths worn thin from decades of use and a perpetually flickering neon sign outside. But it was one of the few places in town that hired without demanding a college degree, which Sarah had been forced to put on hold when her mother got sick 2 years ago. The medical bills had devoured their modest savings, and then some. As she navigated between tables, Sarah glanced toward the large window that faced the parking lot. The November sky hung heavy and gray, promising rain later. Perfect, she thought. Just what she needed when her windshield wipers were barely functioning and her car's heater worked only sporadically. Another expense she couldn't afford to fix. She delivered the plates to a middle-aged couple in booth 4 and turned to check her section, noticing a new customer had slipped in quietly during the rush. An elderly man sat alone at table 7, staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets of the small Midwestern town she'd called home her entire life. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his faded navy cap with a military insignia she didn't recognize, but the careful way he placed it on the table spoke of deep respect. "Good morning," Sarah greeted him, notepad ready. "Can I start you with some coffee?" The man looked up, his blue eyes cloudy with age but still sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows. Deep lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, speaking of both laughter and hardship. "Yes, please, black," he replied. His voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had once been accustomed to giving orders. Sarah poured his coffee with practiced efficiency. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a minute with the menu?" "Just the breakfast special will be fine," he said, barely glancing at the laminated menu. "My doctor says I should watch my cholesterol, but at my age I figure I've earned the right to enjoy my bacon." A hint of mischief flickered across his face. "Coming right up," Sarah smiled, marking down his order. As she turned to put in the ticket, she noticed the elderly man's gaze drift back to the window, a faraway look crossing his features. Something in his expression, a mixture of dignity and solitude, reminded her painfully of her father in his final years. The comparison tugged at her heart. When Sarah returned with the coffee pot to offer a refill a few minutes later, she noticed the man pull out a worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket, opening it to reveal nothing but a few crumpled dollar bills and what appeared to be an old photograph, yellowed with age. He counted the money slowly, his expression falling as he seemed to realize it wasn't enough. The wallet contained perhaps $7 or $8 at most, and the breakfast special cost $9.95 before tax. The man didn't notice her observing this moment of private distress. He tucked the wallet back into his pocket and sipped his coffee, his shoulders slightly hunched now, perhaps already considering how to gracefully admit his predicament when the bill came. Sarah should have moved on. Her tip jar was half empty, and her car had made an ominous clicking sound that morning, a repair bill she absolutely couldn't handle. The electricity notice on her refrigerator had a bold, final warning stamped across it. She had her own problems, her own struggles. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Charity begins at home, Sarah. You can't help others if you don't secure your own oxygen mask first." But something about the man's dignified silence as he stared at his insufficient funds struck a chord within her. The military cap, the way he sat straight despite his obvious age, the solitude that seemed to envelop him like an invisible cloak. It all reminded her too much of her father. James Mitchell had served in Vietnam, returning with a Purple Heart and nightmares he never discussed. He'd worked hard his entire life, only to have his retirement years consumed by illness and mounting medical debt. Would someone have shown him kindness in a similar situation? Making a split-second decision, Sarah approached her manager Hal, a perpetually irritable man with thinning hair and thickening waistline who was tallying receipts at the register. His permanently furrowed brow deepened when he saw her approaching during the rush. "What is it, Sarah? We've got customers waiting." "We'd like to cover that gentleman's meal," she said, nodding toward table 7. "The veteran, can you take it out of my paycheck?" Hal raised an eyebrow, then snorted dismissively. "Sarah, no offense, but you can barely cover your own bills. Your car is practically held together with duct tape and prayers. Why would you—" "Please, Hal, he's a veteran. It's the least I can do." She refused to back down, meeting her manager's skeptical gaze directly. Hal shrugged. "Your call. Don't come crying to me when you can't make rent again." He turned back to the register, adding under his breath, "Bleeding heart's gonna bleed you dry." Sarah ignored the comment, returning to the kitchen where Marcus was plating the elderly man's breakfast. "Hey, Marcus, table 7's meal is on me today, okay? Just don't make a big thing of it." Marcus glanced through the service window at the elderly veteran, then back at Sarah. His expression softened. "Your dad was military too, wasn't he?" 101st Airborne, Sarah confirmed quietly. "Look, I know it's silly when I'm barely making ends meet, but—" "It's not silly," Marcus interrupted, his voice gruff with emotion. "It's decent. World could use more of that." He handed her the plate, then added, "I'll throw in some extra bacon, on the house." Sarah returned to the elderly man's table just as he was about to call her over, likely to admit his predicament. "Here's your breakfast special, sir," she said, setting down the plate that Marcus had indeed loaded with extra bacon. "And I've already taken care of the bill, so please don't worry about it." The man's weathered face registered surprise, then a flicker of embarrassment. "I can't accept that, miss. I may be old, but I still have my pride." His hands, with prominent veins and liver spots, remained firmly on the table rather than reaching for his insufficient wallet. "Consider it a thank you," Sarah said, noticing a small pin on his jacket indicating service in Vietnam. "For your service. My dad was in Vietnam too. He wouldn't let anyone buy him a meal either." She smiled warmly. Stubborn pride must be part of the military training. The elderly man's expression softened at her words, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Your father served?" "Yes, sir, 101st Airborne. He didn't talk about it much before he passed." The man nodded in understanding. Not many of us do. There was a wealth of meaning in those simple words, a shared understanding of things civilians couldn't comprehend. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thomas Reeves." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Well, Miss Mitchell, I'm much obliged. When you get to my age, kindness means more than most people realize." His eyes briefly looked suspiciously damp before he blinked and reached for his fork. "Your father raised you right." That simple compliment meant more to Sarah than any tip could have. She swallowed the unexpected lump in her throat. "Enjoy your breakfast, Mr. Reeves. Let me know if you need anything else." Sarah continued with her shift, weaving between tables with coffee pot in hand, taking orders, delivering food, and clearing dishes in the perpetual rhythm of diner work. Occasionally she caught sight of Mr. Reeves eating slowly, sometimes staring at his food as if lost in thought. Once, she noticed him remove the photograph from his wallet and study it intently, before carefully returning it to its place. The elderly veteran lingered over his coffee, occasionally catching her eye with a grateful nod. When his cup was empty, she'd return with the pot, and he'd cover it with his hand after the second refill, saying, "I've imposed on your generosity enough, Miss Mitchell." Before leaving, Mr. Reeves carefully counted out a small but clearly significant tip, $1.37, possibly all he could spare, and placed it deliberately beside his empty cup. He stood with noticeable stiffness, using the table for support, before straightening his back with military precision. "Thank you again," he said, his voice carrying a quiet dignity. "It's been a long time since someone showed me such kindness without wanting something in return." "It was my pleasure, Mr. Reeves. You have a good day now." As the lunch rush began, Sarah barely noticed when Mr. Reeves departed, but she did spot him climbing, with difficulty, onto a public bus at the stop across the street. She hoped he had somewhere warm to go. The skies had darkened further, and the first heavy raindrops were beginning to fall, drumming against the diner's windows. "You're too soft, Sarah," remarked Donna, another waitress who had observed the interaction. In her 50s, with dyed blonde hair and perpetually skeptical eyes, Donna had worked at the diner for nearly 20 years and prided herself on her pragmatism. That old man could have been running a scam. Plenty of people pretend to be veterans these days. "He wasn't pretending," Sarah replied with certainty. Something in the man's eyes, in the way he'd responded to her mention of her father's service, had been unmistakably genuine. Donna shrugged. "Your money, your choice. Just don't make a habit of it. Tips are bad enough in this place without giving away free meals." The rest of Sarah's day unraveled with discouraging speed. First, Hal cornered her during her break as she sat in the cramped back room, eating a hastily assembled sandwich that Marcus had made for her. "What were you thinking, giving away free meals?" he demanded, his face flushed with irritation. "You know we've got a policy against that." Sarah set down her sandwich. "It was my own money, Hal. Well, from my paycheck. I don't see the problem." "The problem is precedent. It sets a bad precedent." Hal crossed his arms over his chest, the buttons of his shirt straining slightly. "Next thing you know, every hard-luck case that wanders in here will expect a handout. We're running a business, not a charity kitchen." "It was one meal for a veteran who—" "I don't care if he was a 5-star general," Hal interrupted. "Rules are rules, and while we're at it, you've been late twice this month already." Sarah bit back a retort. Both times she'd been late were because her unreliable car had broken down and she'd still arrived within 10 minutes of her shift start. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't. Consider this an official warning, Sarah. One more stunt like that and you're done." Hal's expression held no flexibility. "There are plenty of people looking for jobs these days, remember that." Sarah bit her tongue. She needed this job, barely as it paid. With student loans deferred but still looming and her mother's medical bills from last year's cancer scare, she was one emergency away from financial catastrophe. The last thing she needed was to be unemployed in a town where jobs were as scarce as rain in a drought. Her break thoroughly ruined, Sarah returned to her tables with a forced smile that felt increasingly brittle as the afternoon wore on. To make matters worse, the lunch rush extended well past its usual end time due to a youth sports team stopping in after a tournament, leaving her section in perpetual chaos and her feet screaming in protest. By the time her shift ended, Sarah's tips for the day barely covered what she'd spent on Mr. Reeves' breakfast, plus the gas it would take to get home. As she headed to her ancient Honda Civic in the back lot, the rain was coming down in sheets, soaking through her thin jacket within seconds. When she turned the key in the ignition, the car responded with a clicking sound, then nothing. The dashboard remained dark, not even a flicker of life from the instrument panel. "No, no, no," Sarah murmured, trying again with increasing desperation. "Please, not today." But the car offered only silence, a death knell for a vehicle she couldn't afford to replace or even repair. Sarah leaned her forehead against the steering wheel, fighting back tears of frustration. She'd have to walk the 3 miles home in the pouring rain, knowing that tomorrow would bring the added stress of figuring out how to get to work without transportation. Need a jump? It was Marcus, holding an umbrella and peering through her window with concern. Sarah rolled down her window manually. "I think it's more than a battery this time. Nothing's happening at all." Marcus frowned and motioned for her to pop the hood. After a brief inspection in the rain, he shook his head grimly. "Starter's completely shot, and there's corrosion all over your battery terminals. This is going to need a proper mechanic, Sarah." "Great," she muttered, gathering her purse and the small bag containing leftovers Marcus had snuck her. "Exactly what I need right now. A repair bill I can't pay. I'd offer you a ride, but I'm headed in the opposite direction to pick up my kids from my ex's place." Marcus said apologetically. "Want me to call you a cab?" On what I made today? I'll walk. It's fine, Sarah forced a smile. Thanks for checking, though. By the time Sarah reached her small apartment in a rundown complex on the outskirts of town, she was soaked to the skin and fighting back tears of frustration. Her socks squelched with every step as she climbed the exterior stairs to her second-floor unit, past peeling paint and a flickering hallway light that the landlord had promised to fix 3 months ago. Inside wasn't much better. The apartment was small, a combined living room and kitchenette, a bedroom barely large enough for her double bed, and a bathroom where the shower perpetually dripped despite multiple maintenance requests. But it was clean, and it was hers, and the rent was just within what she could afford on her diner salary. Barely. Sarah peeled off her wet clothes and stepped into a lukewarm shower, the building's water heater inadequate as always. As the water washed over her, she finally allowed herself a moment of self-pity, silent tears mixing with the shower spray. After changing into dry clothes, worn sweatpants and an old university hoodie from the school she'd had to leave, Sarah checked her phone. 3 missed calls from her mother and a text that read, "Just checking in, sweetie. Call when you can." Sarah sighed. Her mother didn't need to worry about her on top of her own health concerns. Better to call tomorrow when she could muster more convincing cheerfulness. As she set the phone down, it buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Reminder, rent due in 3 days, no extensions this month." She collapsed onto her threadbare couch, wondering if her act of kindness earlier had been foolish. Maybe Hal was right. Maybe she couldn't afford generosity. The leftovers Marcus had given her sat on the counter. Her dinner, and probably tomorrow's lunch as well, since her refrigerator contained little more than condiments and a half-empty carton of milk. "What would you do, Dad?" she whispered to the empty apartment. On the small shelf by the television sat her most treasured possession, a framed photograph of her father in his military uniform, young and proud and unburdened by the illness that would eventually claim him. Next to it stood his folded flag from the funeral, encased in a triangular display box that she dusted religiously every week. Sarah knew exactly what her father would say. James Mitchell had lived by a simple code. You do what's right, even when, especially when, it costs you something. He'd gone without countless times to help neighbors, friends, even strangers. Character, he'd told her once, is what you do when no one's watching, and there's nothing in it for you. With that thought providing a small measure of comfort, Sarah ate her dinner in silence, checked the weather forecast, more rain tomorrow, set her alarm for an early bus, and went to bed with a library book she was too tired to read. Her last conscious thought was a hope that Mr. Reeves had made it home safely, wherever home was for him. The next morning dawned gray and uninviting. Sarah had to leave 30 minutes earlier to catch the bus to work, arriving with damp hair and a dampened spirit. The walk to the bus stop had left her shoes wet again, and she knew they'd stay that way until her break, when she might find time to stuff them with paper towels from the bathroom. She tied her apron with resigned determination, preparing for another long day of carrying plates and smiling through exhaustion. "You look terrible," observed Gina, another waitress and Sarah's only real friend at the diner. In her 30s, with vibrant red hair and a perpetually optimistic attitude, despite her own struggles as a single mother, Gina had taken Sarah under her wing when she first started at the diner. "Car died, had to take the bus." "That sucks. How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I can't afford to fix it," Sarah admitted, pouring herself a desperately needed cup of coffee. "Marcus thinks it's the starter. I'd offer to help, but Jaden needs new glasses and his dad is behind on child support again." Gina squeezed Sarah's arm sympathetically. "Hey, did you hear? Hal's on the warpath this morning. Something about a phone call from corporate?" Sarah groaned. The small diner was part of a regional chain called Hallie's Diner, with locations across 3 states. Corporate attention was never good news for the staff. Usually it meant budget cuts or staff reductions, which would put her warning from yesterday in an even more precarious light. Great, just what I needed to hear. Sure enough, Hal approached her before she could even serve her first customer. "Corporate visit today," he said tensely, straightening his tie for perhaps the 5th time that morning. His forehead gleamed with nervous perspiration. Some big shot is stopping by for a quality assessment. Everyone on their best behavior? Got it? No free meals, no mistakes, no excuses? Got it, Sarah replied, resisting the urge to roll her eyes at his obvious anxiety. I mean it, Sarah. Corporate has been looking for underperforming locations to close. We can't afford any screw-ups today. That caught her attention. If the diner closed, everyone would lose their jobs. In a town this size, with this economy, that would be catastrophic for most of the staff. Donna was supporting an ailing husband, Marcus had child support payments, Gina was putting herself through night classes while raising her son alone, and Sarah herself was barely staying afloat as it was. The morning passed in a flurry of nervous energy. Every time the bell above the door jingled, all staff members straightened a little, expecting to see a suit-clad executive with a clipboard and a permanent frown. Hal paced between the kitchen and dining area, straightening menus, wiping already clean counters, and hissing instructions to everyone in his path. "More coffee, table 3, he whispered tersely to Sarah as she passed. "And smile, for God's sake. You look like you're at a funeral." Sarah bit back a retort and fixed her expression into something she hoped resembled pleasant enthusiasm rather than the grimace it felt like. Her feet had started aching an hour into her shift and the damp shoes weren't helping. Around 11, Sarah was refilling salt shakers in the back booth when the bell chimed again. This time there was an immediate, palpable shift in the diner's atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and Hal's nervous cough signaled this might be the dreaded corporate visitor. Sarah glanced up and froze. A sleek black town car had pulled up outside, distinctly out of place in their modest neighborhood. It wasn't just any luxury vehicle, but a limousine with tinted windows and polished chrome that gleamed even in the gray daylight. A driver in a dark suit, complete with cap, opened the rear door with practiced precision, and out stepped a distinguished man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His silver hair was expertly styled, and gold cufflinks winked at his wrists as he buttoned his jacket against the drizzle. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as the man entered, followed by 2 assistants, a young woman and man both in business attire, tapping on tablets. Hal rushed forward from behind the counter, hand extended, face locked in a nervous grin that showed too many teeth. "Welcome to Hallie's Diner. I'm the manager, Hal Peterson. We're honored to have you visit our establishment, if you'd like the best table." But the executive wasn't looking at Hal. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the diner until they landed on Sarah. To her shock, a smile of recognition spread across his face. "There she is," he said, his voice carrying authority but also unmistakable warmth. Sarah froze, the salt shaker still in her hand as the well-dressed man approached her directly, leaving Hal sputtering in confusion behind him. "Miss Mitchell, isn't it?" he asked, extending his hand. Sarah nodded mechanically, mystified. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The man chuckled, a rich sound that carried easily in the now silent diner. "We haven't been formally introduced, but I believe you know my father." He gestured toward the door, where the driver was now helping another person from the car. It was Mr. Reeves, the elderly veteran from yesterday, now dressed in a crisp, button-down shirt and slacks rather than the weathered clothes he'd worn before. His military cap was the same, however, held carefully in his hands as he made his way slowly into the diner. "Dad insisted I meet the young lady who showed him such kindness," the executive explained as Mr. Reeves made his way into the diner. "I'm Robert Reeves, CEO of Reeves Hospitality Group." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Reeves Hospitality Group was a hospitality conglomerate that owned not only the Hallie's Diner chain she worked for, but also dozens of luxury hotels, resorts, and restaurants across the country. And somehow, she had served free pancakes to the founder's father. Hal's face had gone from nervously obsequious to utterly bewildered. "You're Robert Reeves? And this gentleman is?" "Thomas Reeves, the founder of our company," Robert confirmed, his tone matter-of-fact but with an undercurrent of pride. "Though he prefers to keep a low profile these days. Dad likes to visit our establishments incognito occasionally. Says it's the only way to see how they really operate, when there isn't a corporate inspection scheduled. Thomas Reeves approached Sarah with the same humble demeanor he'd shown the day before, though his clothes were of visibly better quality today. There was no trace of the financial distress he'd feigned. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you'll forgive my little deception. I wasn't completely honest about my circumstances." Sarah found her voice, though it came out slightly higher than normal. "No apology necessary, sir. I didn't help you because I thought you needed it. I helped because it was the right thing to do." "That's exactly what I told my son," Thomas said, his eyes twinkling with the same hint of mischief she'd glimpsed the day before. "Character is what you do when you think no one is watching." The echo of her father's words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Robert Reeves stepped forward. "Miss Mitchell, my father told me what happened yesterday. How you paid for his meal from your own pocket, despite your manager's disapproval." He cast a pointed glance at Hal, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible behind the counter. "And how you did it specifically because you recognized him as a veteran, not knowing who he was otherwise." "It wasn't a big deal," Sarah insisted, acutely aware that everyone in the diner was watching this exchange in fascinated silence. Customers had stopped eating, forks suspended midway to mouths. Gina was grinning from ear to ear by the coffee station. Even Marcus had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "On the contrary," Robert continued, "in today's world, genuine kindness without expectation of reward is extraordinarily rare. My father was deeply moved, so much so that he called me immediately after leaving." Thomas Reeves nodded. "I was moved not just by your generosity, but by your sincerity. You mentioned your father served in the 1st Airborne. What was his name?" "James Mitchell," Sarah replied, still trying to process the surreal turn of events. A flash of recognition crossed the older man's face. "Jim Mitchell? From Echo Company?" Sarah's heart skipped. "You knew my dad?" "Not well, but I remember him. We overlapped for a few months in '68 before I was reassigned." "Good man. Brave." Thomas shook his head in amazement. "The world gets smaller as you get older, I find." "He never mentioned," Sarah began, then stopped. Her father had rarely spoken of his time in Vietnam. The war had left scars that went deeper than the shrapnel wound in his leg. It was entirely possible he'd served alongside the founder of a major hospitality company without ever realizing it, or without thinking it important enough to mention. Robert cleared his throat. "Ms. Mitchell, we didn't come here just to thank you, though that would be reason enough. I understand you're facing some difficult circumstances, a car that's broken down, financial pressures." Sarah shot a questioning look at Gina, who raised her hands in innocent denial. She hadn't been the source of this information. Thomas Reeves smiled apologetically. "I may have overheard you speaking with another waitress yesterday about your car troubles and rent situation. Old men are often invisible in public places, which makes us excellent eavesdroppers." Robert continued, "We'd like to offer you a position within Reeves Hospitality Group. Our regional manager for community relations is retiring next month, and we need someone with genuine empathy and integrity. The position comes with a company car, comprehensive benefits, and a starting salary that I believe would alleviate your current financial concerns." Sarah's mind reeled. Was this actually happening? It felt like a scene from one of those Hallmark movies her mother loved to watch, where improbable coincidences led to life-changing opportunities. "But you don't even know my qualifications. I haven't finished my degree." "You demonstrated the only qualification that truly matters to our family business," Robert said firmly. "Compassion without calculation. The rest can be taught." "Our company was founded on that principle," Thomas added. "After I returned from Vietnam, I started with one small diner, not unlike this one, where I made it a policy to never turn away a veteran who couldn't pay. That single diner grew into this company, but somewhere along the way some of our locations seemed to have forgotten our core values." His gaze flicked briefly to Hal, who was studying his shoes with intense interest. Paul, who had been watching this exchange with growing horror, attempted to intervene. "Mr. Reeves, I feel I should mention that Sarah's only been with us for 8 months, and while she's a decent server, there have been some issues with following policies that lack basic humanity. Thomas Reeves interrupted, his voice suddenly carrying the unmistakable steel of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Like being reprimanded for showing kindness to a veteran, that kind of issue? Hal withered under the older man's gaze. In fact, Thomas continued, I found my experience here yesterday rather illuminating. The food was adequate, though the bacon was exceptionally good. He nodded toward Marcus, who beamed with pride. But the atmosphere was tense. Most of the staff seemed afraid of making mistakes. That's not the culture we aim to foster in our establishments. Robert nodded in agreement. We'll be having a separate conversation about management practices at this location. The implication hung in the air, causing Hal to visibly pale. One of the assistants handed Robert a business card, which he passed to Sarah. This position would be based at our regional office in Indianapolis. That's about 40 minutes from here, I believe. Take the weekend to think about it. Call this number on Monday with your decision. And in the meantime, Thomas added with a wink, I hear your car needs attention. My personal mechanic will meet you after your shift. Consider it repayment for yesterday's breakfast, with appropriate interest. Before Sarah could form a coherent response, there was a commotion at the diner entrance. A delivery person struggled through the door with an enormous arrangement of flowers. Roses, lilies, and other blooms she couldn't identify, arranged in a crystal vase that caught the light from the overhead fixtures. Livery for Sarah Mitchell? The delivery person called out, looking around in confusion at the unusual tableau in the diner. Over here, Gina called out helpfully, pointing to Sarah with undisguised glee. As the flowers were set on the counter, Thomas Reeves smiled, a small token of appreciation from an old soldier. The card has my personal number. Please use it if you need anything at all, before you make your decision about the position. I don't know what to say, Sarah managed, overwhelmed by the rapid sequence of events. You've already said everything that matters through your actions, Miss Mitchell, Thomas replied. Now it's our turn to respond in kind. Robert checked his watch. We should get going. We have a board meeting in Indianapolis at 2. He turned to address the staff and customers. Please, everyone, return to your meals. And know that this location isn't closing. Quite the contrary. We'll be using it as a model for a new company-wide initiative. This last part was delivered with a meaningful look at Hal, whose relief at hearing the diner wouldn't close was tempered by obvious anxiety about his own future there. The Reeves men departed shortly afterward, accompanied by their assistants, leaving Sarah in a daze of disbelief. As the limousine pulled away from the curb, customers who had witnessed the scene applauded spontaneously, while Hal retreated to his office, closing the door with uncharacteristic quietness. Gina rushed over, barely containing her excitement. What just happened? Did you seriously get offered a corporate job by the CEO because you gave a free breakfast to his dad? That's straight out of a movie. Sarah could only shake her head in wonder. I think my life just changed, because I did something my father would have done. Girl, you've been struggling for months, picking up extra shifts, never complaining, and always helping others. If anyone deserves a break like this, it's you. Gina hugged her tightly. I'm going to miss you like crazy, but you better take that job. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. Told you it was worth being decent, he said with a gruff smile. Though, I'll admit, I didn't expect quite this level of karma payback. For the remainder of her shift, Sarah moved through her duties in a state of shock. Customers who had witnessed the encounter tipped generously, many adding personal notes of congratulations. Several regulars shared their own stories of kindness repaid, as if the morning's events had opened a floodgate of goodwill. By closing time, news of the encounter had spread throughout the small town via customers with cell phones and social media accounts. Several regular customers came specifically to congratulate Sarah, and even Hal emerged from his office with a grudging apology and an offer to forget about yesterday's warning. You understand, I was just trying to maintain standards, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Corporate expectations and all that. Sarah nodded non-committally, too emotionally drained to hold a grudge or offer forgiveness. The day's events had lifted her beyond such petty concerns. As promised, a mechanic in a Reeves Hospitality Group uniform waited for Sarah after her shift, handing her the keys to a sleek black courtesy car that made her ancient Honda look like the clunker it was. "Your vehicle's being towed to our service center," he explained. "Mr. Reeves insisted we give it a complete overhaul, or if it's beyond repair, he authorized a replacement of equal value to a late-model certified pre-owned." "That's really not necessary," Sarah protested weakly, even as she accepted the keys. "It was just breakfast." The mechanic smiled knowingly. "Mr. Thomas doesn't see it that way. He told me specifically, sometimes a small kindness is a lifeline, Jim. Make sure she can get where she needs to go." That evening, sitting in her apartment with the enormous flower arrangement filling her small living room with fragrance, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry. Not from frustration or worry, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude. The tears came in earnest, releasing months of pent-up stress and the constant strain of financial insecurity. When she had regained her composure, Sarah picked up the card nestled among the blooms. It read simply, "Kindness is never wasted, especially when given freely. Thank you for reminding an old man why he started this company in the first place. Thomas Reeves." Sarah ran her fingers over the embossed lettering, still trying to process the day's events. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Her mother, calling for the 4th time. "Sarah, are you all right?" "I've been worried sick." "I'm fine, Mom, better than fine, actually." Sarah took a deep breath. "You're not going to believe what happened today." As Sarah recounted the story, her mother gasped and exclaimed in all the right places. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. "Your father would be so proud," her mother finally said, voice thick with emotion. "He always said you had his heart." "I miss him," Sarah whispered. "I know, sweetheart, but it seems like he was watching over you today." After hanging up, Sarah approached the shelf with her father's photo and flag. "Thanks, Dad," she murmured, touching the frame gently. I'm going to be okay now." The weekend passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Sarah used the courtesy car to visit her mother, who lived in a modest retirement community 30 minutes away. Together they sorted through Sarah's meager professional wardrobe, her mother altering a blazer that had belonged to her father to fit Sarah's smaller frame. "Something old made new," her mother said, pins between her lips as she adjusted the sleeves. "Just like this chance you're getting." On Sunday, Sarah visited the library to research Reeves Hospitality Group more thoroughly. What she discovered impressed her. The company was known for its veteran hiring initiatives and community investment programs. Employee reviews consistently mentioned excellent work-life balance and opportunities for advancement. The regional community relations manager position would involve coordinating charitable partnerships, veteran outreach, and employee volunteer programs, work that aligned perfectly with her values. By Monday morning, Sarah's decision was made. With shaking hands, she dialed the number on Robert Reeves' business card, half expecting to reach a secretary or assistant. "Robert Reeves," came the immediate answer. "Mr. Reeves, this is Sarah Mitchell from Hallie's Diner." "Ah, Sarah, I've been looking forward to your call. Have you had a chance to consider our offer?" "Yes, sir, I'd be honored to accept the position. Though I want to be honest, I don't have experience in corporate management." Robert's chuckle came through clearly. "Experience can be gained, Sarah. Character is built over a lifetime. My father is an excellent judge of that, and he speaks very highly of you." They discussed details: start date, salary, which was more than triple what she made at the diner, benefits, and training. The conversation ended with Robert saying, "Welcome to the Reeves family, Sarah. We're expecting great things from you." Sarah's last 2 weeks at the diner were bittersweet. Hal maintained a careful distance, treating her with a new and awkward respect. Gina alternated between genuine joy for Sarah's opportunity and sadness at losing her friend. Marcus prepared special meals for her final shifts, insisting it was practice for when you're a big shot and come back to visit. On her last day, the diner staff presented her with a card signed by everyone, even Hal, and a small gift, a professional leather portfolio embossed with her initials. For your new corporate life, Gina explained, hugging her tightly. Don't forget us, little people. Never, Sarah promised, fighting back tears. Her first day at Reeves Hospitality Group's regional office was intimidating. A sleek building of glass and steel, employees in pressed suits, security badges, and a desk with her name on it. But Robert Reeves himself introduced her to the team, making his support clear to everyone. Sarah joins us through unconventional channels, but she exemplifies the values this company was built upon, he explained to the assembled department. Sometimes the best talent isn't found through traditional recruitment. Sarah's learning curve was steep. There were reports to analyze, meetings to attend, presentations to create, but she discovered an aptitude for the work, especially when it involved connecting with community partners and veterans organizations. Her genuine empathy and straightforward approach earned her respect from colleagues and partners alike. 6 months into her new role, Sarah completed her business degree with tuition assistance from the Reeves Employee Education Program. Thomas Reeves himself attended her small graduation celebration, using a cane now, but still standing tall for photographs. I knew you had potential the moment you offered me that meal, he told her. Some people calculate what they'll get in return for every kindness. You never did that calculation. I learned from the best, Sarah replied, showing him the photograph of her father she kept on her desk, alongside the one of her and Thomas from her first day at the company. A year after that, Sarah established a company-wide initiative providing employment opportunities specifically for veterans facing economic hardship. She named it Mitchell's Mission in honor of her father, creating a structured program that included job training, mentorship, and support services. At the program's launch event, Thomas Reeves insisted on standing beside Sarah as she cut the ribbon on the first Veteran Resource Center. Now 85, he had become a mentor and friend to her, often sharing stories about his early days building the company, and occasionally carefully edited tales from Vietnam that helped Sarah understand her own father better. Cameras flashed as the elderly founder leaned in to whisper, "Your father would be proud, and so am I." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," Thomas corrected her with the wisdom of his years. "You did what everyone should do, but what too few actually will, and that has made all the difference." The Mitchell's Mission program expanded to all 50 Reeves Hospitality Group locations within 2 years, helping hundreds of veterans find meaningful employment and stability. Sarah's own career flourished as well. She was promoted to National Director of Community Relations, with an office in the company's headquarters and a team of 20 under her guidance. But she never forgot where she came from. Once a month she returned to Hallie's Diner, now under new management after Hal's early retirement, and sat at table 7, leaving generous tips and occasionally paying for a stranger's meal anonymously. And on each anniversary of that rainy day when she'd served breakfast to an elderly veteran, Sarah received a delivery of flowers with the same simple message: kindness is never wasted. 5 years after joining Reeves Hospitality Group, Sarah stood at a podium accepting an industry award for the company's veteran initiatives. As she looked out over the audience, she spotted Thomas Reeves in the front row, now in a wheelchair, but beaming with pride. Success in business is measured in many ways, Sarah told the crowd, but the true measure of our work is not found in quarterly reports or stock prices. It's found in the lives we touch, the communities we strengthen, and the kindness we put into the world without expectation of return. She paused, her eyes meeting those of the man who had changed her life with a simple test of character. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest ripples in the pond of life, and those ripples can become waves that change everything.